in order to get more quickly into lucrative French and German financial markets. That was the objective of the exercise.
The pet Eurosceptic theory was that she hadn't understood it. I've never heard such nonsense in all my life. The one thing about Margaret was, A, she's got a good mind, B, she immerses herself in detail. She understood perfectly well what she was doing, and she was an enthusiast. I mean, it was all of a piece with the political philosophy of the government. We were removing barriers to trade, we were moving towards free trade. We believed it would be beneficial for the economies of all the member states, including the United Kingdom. And without her personal leadership, I think the European Council would have taken years to get round to what became a very rapid process of deregulation.
The single market settled, work on economic and monetary union, the EMU, now gathered pace. In raising objections, Mrs. Thatcher liked to characterise it as Britain versus the Brussels bureaucracy. She accused the European Commission of trying to take more and more power.
I think she had a pretty fair idea that the social democracy of Europe was undermining her very good capitalist work in Britain. So there was an increasingly uneasy relationship, and she didn't like the way it was going down the federal route. Now, you can argue, as I have myself, that she did a great deal to give the European Union the ambition to advance. The only trouble was it went down the wrong route from her point of view, towards federalism, rather than towards a much looser collection of nations trading and cooperating freely with each other, but not being run from Brussels in a federal manner.
If disharmony characterised Mrs. Thatcher's dealings with European leaders, she thought herself by contrast very much in tune with the American and Soviet heads of state. So when in October 1986 Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev held talks on nuclear disarmament in Iceland without her, Mrs. Thatcher was somewhat miffed, not to say a little alarmed.
Reagan's own Secretary of State was concerned as well, because he looked as though he was going to sell the shop, as it were, without having got proper agreement on the very difficult details that had to be hammered out. But simply to say let both sides abandon every nuclear weapon at the drop of a hat would have created a very insecure situation, and particularly so for America's European allies, who depended on the American deterrent as one of their main protections against the Soviet bloc.
The talks in Reykjavik broke down without agreement. Afterwards, Mrs. Thatcher wasted no time in flying to Washington to correct the President's misguided views on nuclear disarmament. Reagan was chastened, and there were many in the American administration who were grateful for the intervention.
And when Margaret intervened on that, it wasn't that she was against arms control, but she was against an impulsive, not very well-defined gesture. It was something that Ronald Reagan had conceded, which was in the right spirit, but was in danger of going the wrong way too fast.
Mrs. Thatcher saw no contradiction between her defence of the nuclear deterrent and her burgeoning friendship with Mikhail Gorbachev. She saw them rather as two sides of the same coin, keeping the Russian bear in check while encouraging it to open up and do business with the West. Naturally, when she was invited to visit the Soviet Union in 1987, she leapt at the chance.
It was the first visit by a British Prime Minister for a very, very long time, and it was taking advantage of the good personal relationship. And she had the great advantage of being a woman, because she was instantly recognisable. So that going around Moscow or wherever in a large Soviet-style car, she could be seen, people recognised her, they waved at her, and she stopped the car and got out and went over to talk to people and things. They were delighted to have her around as a symbol of an opening up, if you like.
Back in the West, Ronald Reagan seemed finally to forget his non-nuclear aberration, and in early 1988 returned to NATO to fully endorse its latest agreement on weapons, although he seemed a little vague on the detail.
Seen it yet? Yeah, we saw it last night. Oh, no problems. That's very good. Yes, very good. No problem.
Chief of Staff Howard Baker prompting a sudden recollection, but very good was a sentiment Mrs. Thatcher agreed with.
Not all within NATO were quite so keen. Germany, particularly, was reluctant to agree on the modernization of nuclear weapons, a position about which Mrs. Thatcher had strong views.
There's no possibility of clearing the planet of nuclear weapons by the year 2000, nor in the end at all, because, after all, 2 world wars have shown us that conventional weapons are not enough to deter war. And if we want a war-free Europe, then we must continue to have a nuclear deterrent. If you're to deter war, if you're to have an effective alliance, you don't do it with obsolete weapons. Therefore, you have to modernize. That is not in doubt. They all believe it. Some of them are really rather shy in saying it as openly as we are.
It's not in the declaration in quite the way that you've been putting it, though, Prime Minister. It does not use the word modernize, and it actually uses this phrase, keep up to date where necessary, which surely is open to all sorts of interpretations.
Of course it isn't. But you're splitting hairs. This is ridiculous. These weapons will continue to be kept up to date because the whole policy of the alliance is a sure defense, deterrence sufficient to deter any aggressor.
Do you understand the misgivings that the Germans express about being left as the only obvious battlefield in which these modernized battlefield nuclear weapons might be used?
If you're on the front line, then if they cross that front line, of course you would be the first victim unless you won every battle.
So it's bad luck being German, in a sense.
No. Look at history. You can't deny history. You can't deny that it was Hitler that created the last World War and who had to be defeated, and the German freedom started the day the West won. They know that. That is their geography, that is their history. They are on the front line, and the greater their resolve to deter, the greater the certainty of their peace will be.
She was very, very unfair to Germany, and that was related to her wartime childhood. I mean, she really never warmed to Germany, and although Germany, I think, is probably the most changed country in the world, actually, in terms of having put its past behind it, she never appreciated that. She always saw behind the face of Herr Kohl the scowl of Hitler, and that was very unfair because, you know, whether one liked Herr Kohl or not, he had been part of the democratization of Germany.
The strained relationship between the German and British leaders was graphically illustrated by dummies aboard a float in the Cologne Carnival of February 1989.
Everyone was expecting what Europeans have come to term a diplomatic handbagging over Germany's failure to agree to the modernization of short-range nuclear weapons.
But instead, later that month, the Anglo-German summit was all smiles and diplomacy.
Mrs. Thatcher exchanged gifts with Dr. Kohl, and having peered through the wrong end of the opera glasses he'd given her, proceeded to inform us through the usual channels that she could now see no reason why they should not be in full agreement on nuclear decisions.
Well, I think she did realise that she just mustn't let her latent anti-Germanic feelings ever escape in public. So I think, in a sense, she overcompensated.
She liked people whose native language was English. And so the Americans and the Australians and the New Zealanders and so on were much more, to her mind, good rather than Europeans. I don't think it was particularly against Germany, but she, you know, I think she had that sort of wariness about Italians and French and Germans and so on.
Nine months later, East Germany announced the opening of its border with the West. On the 10th of November, the Berlin Wall started to fall. The demise of communism in East Germany was not an isolated event. 1989 was the year the Eastern Bloc began falling apart. From Poland to Romania, communism collapsed. However, while such news was music to the ears of Mrs. Thatcher,